money emerged from barter, essentially. So I prefer pistachios and you prefer macadamia nuts. And therefore, if I have macadamia nuts and you have pistachios, we can trade and we both benefit. Value is created that way. Some goods and services are more sellable than others. Two people need to exactly want what the other have at the same time in the same place, and only then can a trade happen. I think gold really emerged as money just because it was the best form of money based on what properties money should have. Divisibility, durability, scarcity.
Salability across time.
Yeah, gold was for a long time the best option for that. The big problem with gold is that it is divisible, but it's kind of hard. You do need to actually melt it, and it's a process, and you can carry it around, but it's a bit of a risk. It has these properties to an extent, but they're still not perfect.
It's not perfect.
That's why people start to use banks, right? And it started with goldsmiths, but these turns into banks where people do just deposit their gold and get a piece of paper in return just for safekeeping.
Yeah.
And then when they wanted gold back, they would give the piece of paper and then they would get their gold back. But what people started to do instead was they started to pay each other with these receipts for the gold. And that's how paper money essentially emerged.
Guys, I'm here with Aaron van Wirdum for the second episode of our podcast series. We are going to dive a little bit deeper on some of the concepts of economics, but most importantly, we're going to talk about the concepts and ideas behind money, this idea of neutral money, and how different economic theories approach the concept of money. And we will talk about this idea of the regression theorem. This idea encapsulates the contradiction in Austrian economics where value is subjective. So I'm going to tee this up for you, Aaron, and ask you about that.
Yeah, so the big challenge that Austrian economists were sort of faced with early on is if value is subjective. So value is subjective, right? We covered that in the previous episode, or at least that was what the Austrians believed. So I prefer pistachios and you prefer macadamia nuts. And therefore, if I have macadamia nuts and you have pistachios, we can trade and we both benefit. Value is created that way. But why would anyone accept money in trade? Like nuts you can eat, but money you cannot eat. You cannot wear it. You cannot live in it. They're pieces of paper. You can't, they don't fill any want or need in themselves. So why would anyone accept money in trade? That was sort of, it didn't seem to make sense from the Austrian perspective that value is subjective. So that question was resolved by Menger. The idea goes back further than that, but they argued that money emerged from barter, essentially. So some goods and services, goods in specific in this case, are more saleable than others. The example I give in my book is, let's say there's a watchmaker and he's hungry. So now he goes to the bakery and he says, hey, I have a watch. Do you want a watch? Because I want bread. Now, maybe he's lucky on day one and the baker will say, yeah, sure, I'll have the watch and then you can have bread. But then the next day, the watchmaker is hungry again. He goes back to the baker. He says, hey, I want bread in exchange for this watch. Can we trade again? But then the baker is going to say, well, no, I already have a watch. I only need one watch. I don't need a watch every day. So a watch in that sense is not very saleable. It's kind of hard to trade a watch. You need to find specifically someone that wants a watch.
So this I think theory is called the double coincidence of wants. Right?
Yeah,
to kind of solve that problem. Money itself solves that problem, right?
Yeah. So we're getting there. So the problem with barter trade, this barter, is that two people need to exactly want what the other have at the same time in the same place, and only then can a trade happen. So that's indeed called a double coincidence of wants. But some goods are more saleable. So the other example I give in the book is salt. So the baker might need salt every day, and a lot of people might need salt to preserve food, for example, or to spice their food up. Like, it's much easier if you have salt to find someone who wants salt than if you have a watch to find someone who needs a watch. So what happens then, or what happened then, or at least that's sort of the theory that money emerged from trade, is that the watchmaker, if he finds someone who wants to trade salt for the watch, then it's good for him to take the salt, because after that, it's easier to trade the salt than it is to trade the watch. You're going to find more people that want the salt. So over time, everyone sort of starts to realize that other people want salt. Even if they don't need salt themselves, they will be able to trade the salt. And then salt sort of emerges as money. Everyone starts to accept salt in trade at first. So eventually, people also start to sort of stockpile salt, like you just have salt in case they need something else at some other point. And over time, salt would even be used to sort of measure value. So a watch is, maybe worth a kilo of salt. A pair of shoes is worth like an ounce of salt. A bread is, less salt. Like salt starts to become like a unit of measure. So salt, in that sense, becomes money. So it started out as a product in itself that has value for some people, at least, indeed, to preserve food, spice up a meal, maybe use it in combination to bake a bread. Like it has intrinsic value, as you could call that, although that does conflict with the idea of subjective value. But intrinsic value in this sense means it's providing a want or need. But over time, it would emerge as money. People start to use it as money. So they accept trade. They accept salt in trade, not because they want the salt itself, but because they know what they can buy with the salt.
So it had certain characteristics, some certain innate characteristics that made it a better form of money, where the free market sort of saw, whether people realized it or not, logically, it just started to emerge because it had certain characteristics as a money, right?
Right. Yeah. So indeed. So salt, for example, some of these characteristics include divisibility. Like it's very easy to, if you have a pound of salt, to turn it into ounces of salt.
Absolutely.
Right. Just need a scale. It has durability. It doesn't rot or spoil. You can carry it around pretty easily. So it has portability. It's fungible, like 1 ounce of salt or another ounce of salt. It doesn't matter when you have salt is salt. So these are some of the characteristics that make it good money. Now, so salt has actually been used as money in the past. There are societies that used salt as money. Oh, an important one that I forgot to mention is scarcity. It was used as money in particular in places where it was hard to find salt. So there needs to be some level of scarcity. If anyone can just find salt everywhere, then it doesn't make for good money, right?
And then it can also be consumed. So there's this natural, some of it gets taken out of existence. Right. So it has all these different characteristics. It's very interesting, right? Divisibility, portability, fungibility.
Right. So salt has been used as money, but what the product that evolved as money in particular everywhere in the world basically was gold. So gold also has all these properties that I just mentioned: divisibility, portability, scarcity. So gold started to be adopted as money, globally, essentially. Now, the other part of the question is, okay, so how much is money then worth? So now money emerged through barter, essentially, through the free market. So how much is it worth? And that's where Mises comes in. This is called the regression theorem. And he said that people would learn how to value money based on past experience, basically. So if an ounce of salt could buy you a loaf of bread yesterday, then you're probably going to be willing to accept an ounce of salt today, knowing that you can probably buy another loaf of bread with it tomorrow. So based on past experience, you know what money is more or less worth.
So at least when I educate people and talk to people about money, we call this acceptability, like the history of acceptability, right? Which is something that, although a new money, for example, something like Bitcoin could have all of these other characteristics, and it outperforms, whether it be divisibility, fungibility, scarcity, salability through time, all of these characteristics that are important for a good money, right? These fundamental characteristics. Acceptability is something that takes time to evolve, and it's the one thing that other monies that have had an advantage have as advantage, because, like you said, if an ounce of salt was accepted yesterday, the day before that, you have a pretty good idea that it's going to be able to be accepted the following day.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, if you want to skip ahead a bit, because towards the end of my book, I kind of make the case that the regression theorem, which is what we just discussed, was sort of turned upside down by Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin really does not have any intrinsic value, to call it that way. So rather than seeing what it was worth in the past, I think Bitcoin actually has value or start to be accepted as payments because the perceived value in the future, which is really the important thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not as important what you could buy with it yesterday. It's important what you can buy with it tomorrow.
That's an interesting take, right?
So because Bitcoin has this limited supply, you can sort of make calculations. You can sort of reason like, well, what if Bitcoin catches on? What if Bitcoin becomes a global money? How much would a Bitcoin be worth then?
Yeah.
And then you can sort of make a calculus, like what is the percentage chance that happens? And based on that, you can sort of determine, well, that's what I'm willing to pay for it then, or that's what I'm willing to trade for it then. So that's the calculus that Helvini, for example, first introduced. Like that's his reasoning. That's the reasoning that he posted on the cryptography mailing list at that time.
Yeah, I think his logic was largely proven right from that famous.
So far so good. Yeah,
so
indeed.
far so good.
Yeah.
I think that's largely accurate, right? If you understand these fundamental characteristics of money and you look at societies throughout time, see what different monies, how they interact with each other. And again, we could have 10 episodes on all these different, whether it be shell money or plastic beads or salt, all these different cattle, right, or furs, right. We could go down so many different rabbit holes here, but I think the important idea is there are these fundamental characteristics surrounding money, and money is like another good or another commodity in society, right? It's this free market tool that naturally can arise. And I think that this is the cornerstone of the commodity theory of money. What are your thoughts on the commodity theory of money versus the credit theory of money? Have you gone down those rabbit holes?
That's sort of besides the point. Like that's more Lynn Alden's.
She talks a lot about that in her recent book.
Yeah. I mentioned it briefly, but in the Genesis book, it's more like a footnote kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So I think the footnote I make is that this idea that money emerged from barter has been disputed by archaeologists, for example, and they argue that money is really originally credit-based, indeed, while what I was just arguing is more the commodity-based version of it.
Yeah.
My sort of take on that is that both versions, existed, are true, and it really depended on how much trust there exists in a society. So let's say you're if you live in a small town or in any town, and people kind of know each other, then you can easily have a credit-based money. But if you're a traveling merchant, right, in the 15th century, then you can't have that. So then you really need a commodity money. So the level of trust involved really determines that. And in that sense, Bitcoin is supposed to be trustless. Like Bitcoin really exists in the domain of people can't trust each other. You can't trust the other Bitcoin users. You can't trust whoever you're interacting with. It needs to be this trustless system. So in that sense, it fits better in the trustless or in the commodity money theory. But I think there's validity to both theories. I think they just sort of existed side by side, in parallel, or even in combination with each other. I mean, you can make credit-based money on top of Bitcoin, and since where the credit exists is Bitcoin, but the underlying commodity also still exists, right?
So with the money, the fiat money that many people that we use today, right? There's no monetary premium on that piece of paper. Let's talk a little bit about, because I know we use salt as an example, right?
Yeah, we didn't get into the monetary premium.
Let's kind of touch on that just a little bit.
Yeah, so the theory essentially, I was talking about salt as theory, right, or salt as the example.
Yes.
And the point is that at the moment that salt is started to be accepted in trade and stockpiled for future trade, it becomes a store of value, then it gains this monetary premium. So it has sort of a base value based on the demand for salt, the actual demand for salt, the actual demand people have to spice up their food or conserve their food. But then as it starts to circulate as money, it becomes worth more. There's more demand for salt than the actual demand for salt, so to say. There's demand to just hold on to it. So salt increases in value in that sense. That's the monetary premium.
Do you think this is a good thing, personally?
Do I think it's a good thing?
Yeah. Do you, like, for example, gold has a monetary premium. Do you think that it's
probably not actually? I mean, it's better if all goods and services in a society are just worth what the actual demand is, rather than them gaining some premium, because that means that the people that do have the actual demand now need to pay more for it.
Yeah, I think
so. Maybe a good example, a modern example of that, is also like house prices. Like I think a lot of people essentially use real estate as a store of value.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that.
Well, yeah. I'm not posing it as a question. Like it is a fact.
That's a fact.
Yeah, that people use real estate as a store of value. So that increases the cost, the price of real estate, which means that the people that actually need a house to live in now need to pay more because the other people are using it as a store of value. So it would, I think, I'm pretty sure it would benefit society if the store of value was like purely a money that has no other use cases, and then all other products and services in a society are just worth what the actual demand for it is. I think that would be a healthier economy.
I agree with you completely. I've been thinking about this for a long time, right? Because on the surface, it's fiat money solves that problem, but instead it actually pushes this monetary premium on another asset, which is, houses and real estate, right?
Yeah.
And I think
for a big part,
Bitcoin largely fixes this in a lot of ways.
I mean, that's a very interesting, prospect for future society. Like if Bitcoin would actually start to sort of attract all this store value potential, like what would happen to real estate prices? What would happen to just the entire economy? But real estate is a big one. Could completely upset that.
Yeah.
But I would say in a good way.
I think, real estate would still do well as an asset class. I just think that, it would be more selective towards areas where there really is that strong demand instead of just everywhere, right? Why people are just pouring money into real estate because they know that the dollar is getting debased, and they know that they can't just sit on money because of inflation and money printing and all of these things that are happening, right? They intuitively know that, right? So it's like this massive asset inflation that encourages, we're putting money here, we're putting money there.
But in a world where Bitcoin becomes the dominant store value, why would you actually still invest in real estate?
You'd have to want to own property there, or you'd have to actually evaluate, hey, this area has high demand to live in, so this particular area I could see the value going up here. But the
it would have to
premium,
outperform Bitcoin.
It wouldn't be BlackRock, printing. It wouldn't be like they're printing all this money, and then they're BlackRock and the big banks get access to it first with the Candlelight effect, and then hey, 1/2 of all of the properties in the U.S. are getting single-family homes are getting bought up by subsidiaries of BlackRock, which is what we've seen, right? So it's like, and you can't really blame them because they know the money's being debased, and of course they're going to put it in an asset that's going to store value over just holding fiat dollars that are being printed essentially by pressing a button on a computer screen, right? So very interesting. It's like I was reading about Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, and it's like. The stock market was going up 1,000%, right?
Yeah,
it's like, is the stock market really going up 1,000%, or are people just putting their money into something that's not going to lose value as quickly as the money that's being printed?
Of course. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. The stock market is another good example of it's just a substitute store value rather than keeping your money, your value in money that's debased. You just put it in the stock market.
Let's talk a little bit about the article by Nick Szabo, Shelling Out. I think that's such a great research report about the concept of money and the idea of some of the science behind it. What are your thoughts there? I think he brings up so many interesting points about salary, how these words come from the ideas of different things as money, right? Another one is shelling out, right? The whole concept of his essay, which is like the fact that the United States actually used shells as money for the first 50 years of colonists being here, because the Brits wouldn't allow coinage to come here, right? So they used what the Native Americans used here. This idea of hey, can I borrow a buck, which is like a skin, we call a buck is like an animal fur, it's a skin, right? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so Shelling Out is a paper by Nick Szabo, indeed. And he studied, you could sort of say, the history of money, prehistory of money, even like how did money emerge? So he did his own studies on that. And the point he makes is that it sort of ties in with the credits theory of money. So when societies are small enough, so let's say, or the hunter-gatherer tribes, or sort of Native American tribes before the settlers came in, if the tribe is small enough, like up to 100 people or so, which is that's roughly what the size of prehistoric tribes were, then everyone in that tribe can sort of keep track of who's contributing what. So, you got a couple of guys are hunters, and then some other, maybe the women are collecting mushrooms and berries, and someone else is maybe hunting for fur, whatever. Everyone's sort of doing their part. And then when they, for example, when some man hunts an animal and they have food, then they share that food with the tribe, and then everyone can sort of recall, like, oh yeah, these guys, I got some fruit from them, and the next time that I'm going to find some berries, I'm going to share with them as well. So that way there's sort of a mutual altruism. Everyone sort of helps each other because everyone keeps track, mentally of who's contributing what. And if someone would be a freeloader, if someone would take but never give back, then, they would be excluded from the tribe, or they wouldn't actually get anything later on.
I think the term he uses is reciprocal altruism.
Yeah, that's
like
term.
Kind of the concept and the idea.
Yeah, correct. Now, this falls apart when the tribe grows too big, or when several tribes sort of combine or something like that. So if there's too many people involved, then it becomes hard to keep track of who's contributing what. And in a way, freeloading at that point becomes a good strategy. You just take and you never give back. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have to expend any resources or risks of hunting or anything. You just get it, you just take and you never give back.
And I think this is where the concept of socialism and communism really break down, because we see this in nature. And what you just described, I believe I think they call it Dunbar's number. There's only so many relationships you can have, right? And Nick Szabo also raises this idea of once there's so many relationships and there's so many people, and you did the favor for somebody and they did a favor for you, and even under the number of under Dunbar's number, it's like you might have given somebody something, and at the time it was to you it was a big deal, and 3 years later when you need to call back the favor, they misremember it differently, and they don't realize the significance of it, so they value it differently, right? Because memories are they change over time, and people, we're only human, right? We're imperfect, and it's just we can't only store so much information. We can only remember things, and people have different memories and reoccurrence of events, and there's there can be a big problem with that, right?
Yeah, so Szabo found that people for that reason start to use money, essentially, or actually describes it as proto money. So for the most part, this was jewelry. So it's an interesting question, right? Why do people like jewelry? Why are we the only animals that wear necklaces or rings or these kinds of things? And his point is that it's really ingrained in our DNA, so to say, in the same way that language is. Like we it's ingrained in our DNA that we learn to speak language to communicate with each other. And things like jewelry are ingrained in our DNA as sort of something that we value. And that's how this evolved over time, of course, that humans started to do that. And his point was that this was like proto money. So this was the first type of money. So instead of keeping track of who provided what, tribes, especially between each other. So if there were different tribes living in the same area, then between each other they start to trade proto money, jewelry. Mm-hmm. And this proto money had three main characteristics. So the first one was it's easy to recognize. It's easy to recognize what it is, and that it is indeed what it is. So could be some scarce feather or a shell, or something that people can easily see for, yeah, this is what it is. The second one is it's easy to carry around, or at least easy to protect. So that's why a necklace, like you have it around your neck. If you have it around your neck, you're not going to lose it. And if someone wants to steal it from you, well, they have to steal it at least physically, right? So it's like you're protecting it by wearing it. And the third one is scarcity. So it has to be something that's scarce, that's not easy to produce. It had to require some effort to actually make it, or to find it, or to, something scarce. And this emerged as money. So this is sort of where money emerged, he says. It ties in with the regression theory to some extent, but it is a different take on it. Mm-hmm. And so the reason he was researching this is because he was one of the cypherpunks. I think we'll get more into that later on. Mm-hmm. But he was one of the cypherpunks, and he wanted to create digital cash, electronic cash. But the way he figured to do that was to really sort of reinvent money. Mm-hmm. So that's why he studied the history of money, or the prehistory of money. Like, where did money really emerge from? Where did it really come from? What attributes does money really need to have in order to be adopted as money? So that's the research he was doing, and that's how he came with that paper.
Was it Nick that coined the term unforgeable costliness?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That's the scarcity, but that's a more technically accurate term. Yeah.
But this idea of, why would these people spend all these hours, putting in this proof of work almost to create this beautiful necklace, or this beaded chain, or this elaborate fur skin, whatever it may be.
So people need to be able to see what it is, and that it's scarce, therefore, as well. So it needs to be scarce, and people need to recognize that sort of immediately. Like, yes, this is a scarce thing.
You need to be able to almost verify, with your eyes,
yes,
right? You can verify, okay, look at all the work that went into this.
Exactly.
There's hundreds or, tens or whatever hours of this.
Mm-hmm. But so it contradicts the regression model in the sense, or the regression theory in the sense that it doesn't start as a commodity necessarily. It starts more as a collectible, or it starts more jewelry. It doesn't need to have any other future than that. Mm-hmm. Now, you could say jewelry is a future. It looks nice. Mm-hmm. But then the question is, why do we humans think it looks nice? Why do other animals not have that? So his point is, well, it's just ingrained in our DNA to value that, because it helps us survive as a species.
It's an evolutionarily inbuilt advantage, maybe. And he might make the argument even that this advantage, this idea of proto money, or the ability to transact, and again, these transactions weren't often, right? It might be one tribe would, every 6 months those goods would move, and he provides evidence in his paper that indeed this beautiful necklace that was made by this tribe by the sea, found its way inland to another tribe, right? And then there's this movement, and this every time that transaction goes, it kind of subsidizes all of the hours of input that went into making it. And I think he does actually make the argument that the specializations of Homo sapiens and the ability to trade and use this proto money allowed them to survive better than maybe other hominid species early on, right? Because
exactly, that's the evolutionary pressure. That's why humans learned language, and indeed also this. They learn to use money. It has an evolutionary benefit. It helps us survive in the rough nature.
I'll go so far to say that maybe the evolution and the development of early money, the concept of money itself almost allowed civilization to take off the way it has, right? It allowed us to outcompete, the Neanderthals and Homo floresiensis and these other hominids that existed. Australia, I'm not certain of the exact terms of all of them, but there were other hominid species.
That was the Neanderthals, of course.
And there was a couple others as well, actually.
There were like 5 or 6 types of human at some point.
It's kind of wild, right? If you think about that, like, go back, 100,000 years or however long, and that there were actually other, species of humans that, were living on the planet at the same time as our, species of human, right?
Yeah,
kind of wild.
But it's very possible that what distinguished us from them is our ability to use money.
Wow.
That we sort of had that in our DNA, and that allowed us to thrive compared to them.
I'm
not sure that's the case, but I think that's a very plausible theory.
I think so too. I've been actually going down that rabbit hole myself and studying, Neanderthals and trying to find more evidence. Did these other hominids use, decorations and stuff, and do they use necklaces? And is there evidence of that at different archaeological sites? And I think that the evidence greatly weighs to finding those types of things, or more developed versions of those things with Homo sapiens,
Right.
As opposed to some of these other subspecies of humans. I
Right.
think there's a lot less evidence for that,
Right.
which is interesting. It's very interesting. Do you have any other closing thoughts about shelling out? Any ideas we didn't touch on from Nick's work there?
On shelling out specifically, no. I mean, the only thing I would say, I do consider it sort of a must-read paper for
Absolutely.
anyone in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
It is sort of fundamental.
Just anybody who's interested in money or archaeology or evolution or really any of these fields. I mean, I think it's a very interesting perspective, and you will no matter where you're at or what you're interested in, you'll come out of reading that essay and you'll learn something that you never knew. The fact that the United States settlers initially, when they came to the U.S., like they did not use gold or paper, or they literally used shells as money for decades. That to me kind of blew my mind. Like, wow, the first loan apparently in the United States was a loan of shells by I think it was I'm not sure exactly where, but one of the first colonies, right? It was a shell loan.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Is that in the paper?
I
Shelling
think it
out?
is mentioned in Shelling Out very briefly. That the very
I mean, it's a while since I read it.
Yeah, so like that. So you'll come out of reading that essay, just you will learn something no matter what you're interested in. So like many of Nick's blog posts and work, I think you'll be fascinated.
Yeah. I mean, an example, of course, is a leading thinker in the digital currency space in general.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk a little bit about gold, how gold emerged, what your thoughts are there, the properties of gold, how it started to be issued off of paper, the idea of banknotes, and then ultimately.
Yeah, so how do you transition from gold to fiat? Is that sort of your question?
Yeah, but let's talk about gold a little bit, what your thoughts are on gold as a money, how it naturally emerged. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think it's important because there are so many gold bugs and people that, and rightly so, gold has been throughout most of history the best natural type of money.
Yeah. I think gold, so I don't actually believe in the regression theorem personally. As I mentioned earlier, I think Bitcoin kind of contradicts that. I think the regression theorem was close, but not quite. So gold bugs will often argue that gold has intrinsic value, but it's not obvious to me what that intrinsic value then would be, because some of the things they'll mention is like semiconductors. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, gold has been used as money for thousands of years, so that can't explain why people accepted gold 3,000 years ago. Then people will mention like jewelry, mm-hmm. But as we mentioned just in the shelling out story, I think that's upside down. I don't think people want to have gold jewelry because it's expensive. Gold isn't expensive because it can be used as jewelry. Do you see what I'm saying? They got it the wrong way around.
I've thought about this a lot as well, and I think we see this. People value scarce things. I feel like that's almost what it is, right? Whether it's a mammoth tooth or a rare shell or some rare rock that you found, or so precious metals.
So
right?
You can make a weak argument about gold looks pretty, mm-hmm. But I think people just like it because it's scarce. I think gold really emerged as money just because it was the best form of money based on what properties money should have. So again, divisibility, durability, scarcity,
salability across time.
Yeah, like all these things. I think gold was for a long time the best option for that. I think that's the reason. I don't think there was like an intrinsic value reason for gold, personally. Now, of course, the big problem with gold is that it is divisible, but it's kind of hard. You do need to actually melt it, and like it's a process, and you can carry it around, but it's a bit of a risk. So it has these properties to an extent, but they're still not perfect.
It's not perfect, yeah.
So then that's why people start to use banks, right? And it started with goldsmiths, but these turns into banks where people do just deposit their gold and get a piece of paper in return just for safekeeping.
Yeah.
And then when they wanted gold back, they would give the piece of paper and then they would get their gold back.
Yeah, I totally agree with you here.
But what people started to do instead was they started to pay each other with these receipts for the gold. And that's how paper money essentially emerged. Like that turned into, so now people, instead of giving each other gold, they start to give each other the receipts for gold.
Yeah, because those receipts had certain characteristics of money that
they're easier to carry around, and they're lighter. They're also easier to divide. You can easily
divisibility,
exchange one piece of paper for 10 with a small denomination.
Yeah, and I think the one thing we didn't touch on is assayability, which is like, it was very hard to verify, is this gold real? Is it pyrite? Is it some other precious metal that's wrapped? Whereas with a paper money that was issued by a bank, they put a stamp on it. You wouldn't necessarily have to worry about that as much as you would with every time you transact with gold.
It's real gold. Counterfeiting money is a thing, of course. For paper money as well. But paper money definitely had obvious benefits, and it was just easier to make payments, right? Mm-hmm. So then, as people started to use that as money, the banks, the goldsmiths, now banks, they start to realize that not all the gold was people wouldn't always exchange their money back for gold, their paper bills back for gold, because it was circulating. So they started to realize they could actually issue more paper bills than they had gold in reserve. So now you have fractional reserve banking.
So are you telling me that a trusted third party could be a security hole here?
I think so. Yeah.
It's almost human nature, right? So anytime that there's this, humans have a chance to abuse a system or do something, eventually, given enough time or given the right person in that position of power, they will absolutely, end up fudging things or abusing things, right?
Yeah. So anyways, that's how you get to fractional reserve banking. And as we discussed in the previous episode, at some point, the central bank was introduced to, act as a lender of last resort because there was fractional reserve banking. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how over time gold evolved into fiat currency system, where eventually gold was just taken out of the equation altogether, and it was just this paper money that people were using that could be manipulated in all kinds of ways.
So before we move on to this paper money, let's talk about this last concept of gold, of sort of why gold emerged all over the world as a better money than, say, shells or mammoth teeth or glass beads, that could in their own right in some scenarios be scarce, right? Why did gold, really was the backing of like the Renaissance and all these great periods of, the Roman Empire before they started coin clipping and doing all this stuff? Why did gold seem to always emerge? Or why was gold the best thing we had?
I think gold has the best properties of money. So we mentioned some of the properties. I mean, scarcity is a big one.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the only one that's relevant. There are other metals that are maybe equally scarce, but have other harder to divide. Like gold is soft, right? I just think in general there was sort of an open competition for money, and gold won out.
Yeah.
In large part because it's more scarce than many other things, and scarce everywhere. But the other properties are relevant as well. It's just the best form of money until something better was invented.
What are your thoughts on stock to flow? Because I think that might be like kind of what we're kind of dancing around it here, but I think that might be the concept of gold that makes it the best money. Yes, there's other things that are scarce, but if they're highly desired, and we've seen this if you study different civilizations, how they've come up, when they've interacted, and say the Europeans, when they went to Africa, they found that, oh wow, they're using this type of money that we can easily produce and hyperinflate essentially and take the real goods from society.
I'm not completely sold on that theory. I think there's something to it, but I think there's also a circularity to it where the stock to flow is not fixed. The stock to flow is not fixed, right? Like if there's more demand for gold, then there's more reason to mine it, and then the stock to flow would change. But so I don't think it's a fixed thing. So if the argument seems a little bit circular to me.
Okay. So from my understanding, it's if there's more demand for gold, there's been this natural barrier to inflate that stock to flow. Whereas other metals, whether it be silver even or copper or beads or shells, if there's a demand, they could easily go and research or dig and get so much more of that gold to basically inflate the supply much more quickly. Whereas gold, it's kind of been in this band of 1% to 3% a year historically, where that, like, no matter how much demand there is for gold, the producers can only go find 1% to 3% more of the supply per year.
No, I don't believe so.
You don't believe that?
No, okay. I mean, if there's enough, I think the demand is more naturally limited by the growth of the economy. Like if for some reason the demand would skyrocket, then you could just invest way more resources to find the gold, and you could get the stock to flow or the percentage of new gold higher than that. So that's why I'm calling it. That's why I'm saying I think the argument is a bit circular in a way. I think there's something to it. I mean, the general concept of scarcity I would agree with, but I think stock to flow, from what I understand and what I've read and what I thought about, it seems too rigid. Definitely the stock to flow model I don't believe in.
Particularly that model when it comes to just from a statistical background, right? Like all models are eventually wrong. Some are useful, right? So there might be some use to that. I think that might be what you're getting at, but
I don't think there's any use to the stock to flow model. I think it's a big joke.
Oh, you think it's a big joke? Okay.
Yes, pretty much. Like the concept of stock to flow itself, there's something to it. Like but the concept of scarcity and how costly it is to dig something up. There's something to it, but I think it's thought of too rigidly. I like to take more of a step back a little bit and just say there's an open competition. These are the properties that money should have. One of them is, cost of creating more of it. Like it's definitely a factor, and it's probably a big factor.
I'm just thinking that
maybe
give it another
but I see it more as a combination of these factors, and that's how a winner emerges.
I think you're right. I think there's a combination of factors. I guess what I'm getting at is just that when it comes to like something like silver compared to gold, it is harder to dig more gold out of the ground if it's in demand, as opposed to something like silver where it's a lot easier to get more silver out of the ground. I guess it's more common and it's easier to find, as opposed to gold.
Yeah, but what if I'm half thinking out loud now, of course. But
let's talk about it.
I mean, why would it be cheaper to get gold out of the ground than silver?
We'll say that one more time.
Why would it be cheaper to dig up gold than silver?
I guess from my research, gold deposits are much more scarce than silver deposits, so it's a lot harder to find.
I understand. Yeah.
So there's a lot more. It requires a lot more proof of work, a lot more investment, and it's a lot harder to extract. And I think if you study the
but it's about percentages, right?
Correct. So if you study the historical percentages of when silver's in high demand, the producers are able to extract a lot more of that more quickly out of the earth. Whereas something like gold, even if the demand for gold goes up, they might be able to increase, somewhat, but it is a more demanding process and it's harder.
Well, let's take a more cryptocurrency relevant example. So why, like if the stock, I don't know if we should stick to the stock to flow model, but if you stick to the stock to flow model, then Bitcoin and Litecoin should be worth the same because they both have the same stock to flow. Yet that's completely not true. Bitcoin is
I think it's just
more.
one of many factors, right?
Yeah, so then I think stock to flow proponents will say Litecoin is a scam or there's something else wrong with it, but I don't find that a very compelling argument. I think the more plausible explanation is the stock to flow model just it doesn't make sense. I think there's another reason for gold, for Bitcoin, that it's worth more. I don't think it's stock to flow. I mean, scarcity is fundamental. Don't get me wrong. Like that's important, but this sort of rigid approach to it as a model that predicts anything or as sort of the only thing that matters, I'm not one to agree with that.
Okay, interesting take. I personally think it's one of many factors, right? So it's one thing to consider, to think about, right?
I'm fine with, like I said, there's something to it, and I think it's sort of thinking in the right direction, at least in a way, but it's not a black and white type of thing for me at all.
Okay, let's move along to talk more about how fiat emerged, how the end of the gold standard emerged, how World War I potentially may have started, the end of the gold standard, how governments were able to take over, because we talked a lot about how banks issued notes off of gold. So how did governments, because again, we talked about, banks issue banknotes, and that was a useful form of money because it had certain characteristics that might have been better than using physical gold for everyday transactions. How did eventually governments get to the point where they were able to take control of that process?
I mean, the introduction of the Federal Reserve is a big one of that, of course. So as we discussed, as with banks running on fractional reserves, they were essentially unstable. So if there was a bank run on a bank, if too many people wanted to get their money out at the same time, then the bank would go bankrupt. And this could, people would lose their money, and this could even have a contagious effect across the economy. So to sort of stabilize the economy, the Federal Reserve was installed to act as a lender of last resort. So if a bank would start to go under, then they could call the central bank and say, hey, we actually need money because we're going bankrupt otherwise. And then the central bank would make that loan. But over time, of course, the central bank has sort of expanded its mandate quite a lot. So one of the first things they started doing was to manipulate interest rates to sort of steer the economy. And yeah, I mean, over time, gold was even just taken out of the equation entirely, so they could do that even more freely. Because until then, the gold was still sort of stopping them from doing. They still had to have a gold ratio,
some control on that.
Yeah, so they couldn't do that as much as they wanted to, or there was some limit to it. Until specifically in 1971, gold was taken out of the equation entirely, and they could just they had free reign to do that as much as they wanted to. And eventually, of course, we've even seen central banks issue bailouts to companies or banks that were going to bankrupt otherwise. So they even start to sort of influence the economy in that sense.
So the classical gold standard, that was pre-World War I, where it was like it was locked in. And then during World War I, in order to essentially print the money and steal the money from everybody in society to fund that war, to the United States participation in that war, they had to debase and basically break that classical gold standard. What was that called then after that?
Yeah, so it went through a couple of stages. There's the classic gold standard, and there was the gold exchange standard, which was in place for a couple of years. And that was a pretty complicated or complex design. So gold was used for international trade, but then domestically, every country would stabilize its own, use the CPI internally within the country to sort of keep it stable. But what that meant was that if gold would cross borders through export and import, then that would affect how the different countries and their different central banks would have to respond to that. If there was an inflow of gold, I believe they would have to increase interest rates, and if there was a outflow of gold, they would have to decrease interest rates. And in this way, a trade balance was supposed to be kept up. It was kind of a complicated thing that didn't last for very long. It was during the interbellum, basically, I believe that this was in place for a little while. I go in more detail in the Genesis book, of course, but if you read it, it was this short window, and it sounded kind of like a mess. And so they had to play by what was called the rules of the game. So every country would have to sort of play by certain rules.
This is just classic Keynes. Everyone's got to play by the rules of the game. Right? Governments will just be counter-cyclical with their spending approach. I mean, it's a huge, I think, lack of judgment and foresight on his thinking.
Yeah, there was no way to actually enforce this. It was just sort of a gentleman's agreement kind of thing, supposed to be that.
A gentleman's agreement between, all these countries that, have different.
Yeah, we're basically just came out of a war, and, of course, would enter into a new war soon enough. So, yeah, no one kept to the rules of the game. I think they even, there was no realistic time where everyone was doing that. So it was kind of a crazy
that made me
intermediary. It wasn't the actual gold standard, and there wasn't fiat currency. It was some sort of weird in-between thing for a couple of years. But basically, the short version of the story is that every country just abused it. And instead of playing by the rules of the game, they all debased their currency in their own favor.
Of course. That was inevitable.
Yeah. And then ultimately it led to at least the Second World War happened, and then they sort of abandoned that idea. It's an interesting part of history, but it's kind of so crazy.
Yeah.
And that... And it lasted so short that it's interesting to sort of consider it, but I don't know how in depth you want to go. Basically, it didn't work. That's just sort of the short version. They had this weird idea where it wasn't quite a gold standard. It wasn't
This
quite
was kind
a
of
fiat
like
standard.
Irving Fisher's influence with the stabilizers, and they wanted to keep everything consistent, and they wanted to try to, instead of spontaneous order, they wanted to centrally plan and manipulate, keep everything the same.
Yeah, but because it was happening per country, but then because of imports and exports, things got crooked again, and then the way to correct that was through interest rates. It was just a completely failed experiment.
Hayek obviously
for a little while
rejected this, right? Prices can't be stable with place and time, and all these different things are all different factors, right?
I mean, indeed, if you we went over that for a bit, but indeed, if you manipulate interest rates, then it kind of distorts the economy. So if you're doing that in every country, then it distorts the economy everywhere, and also it affects people differently than what the economy should want, so to say. So rather than the people that are selling their products and services more, getting more money, it could be the case that creditors or debtors, like they were affected differently. They would get more or less resources rather than letting the economy just play itself out. That was maybe more interesting because it lasted a bit longer, is the Bretton Woods system. So we got this mess in between the First and Second World War, which didn't last for more than 10 years, and that's even being generous to say that it lasted 10 years. But then after the Second World War, you got the Bretton Woods system. So this meant that basically the dollar became the central or the global currency. So the dollar was going to be backed by gold, $35 per ounce of gold, if I'm not mistaken. And then every other country would use the dollar to make international payments. So if the UK wanted to buy something from France, they wouldn't use gold, they wouldn't use the pound, and they wouldn't use the franc, but they would use dollars for international trade. So the United States, in that sense, got a very central role in the world economy. They would issue the currency that everyone else would use, which of course was a big benefit for the United States because, technically it was backed by gold, right? So technically they said we're going to back our dollar by gold, but there's a good reason to believe that they printed more dollars than they had gold backing for. So in that case, it's very advantageous for the US that everyone was using the dollar.
So the concept you previously described would be known as monetary nationalism, right? That's...
but I mean, basically, yeah. So monetary nationalism is in a way the concept of fiat currencies. So there were different forms of that. So one of them was indeed the gold exchange standard, but another form of that you could say is just fiat currency in general. It's this idea that you have a national money. So yeah, Hayek made a case against that because, this is what I briefly went over a minute ago.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of going back to that.
Yeah, so it's this idea that if there's demand for one industry in an economy, in a country, then it would affect the entire country in a way. So if you're an American and you want to buy British cars, you want to buy a British car, then you would first have to exchange your dollars for pounds to get this British car, and then you buy the British car. So if enough people do this, enough people are exchanging their dollars for pounds and getting British cars shipped to the US. But what this does is it also affects the value of the dollar and the pound. The pound becomes worth more in comparison to the dollar. So what this does in turn is everything in the United Kingdom, in England, is affected by that, and everything in the United States. It affects the total trade balance. So it doesn't just affect the part of the economy that's relevant here, the car industry. No, if you want to buy clothes from England, if you're an American, now also you have to pay more for clothes because the pound went up in value against the dollar. Now clothing is also more expensive in the UK. So or potatoes or whatever you can think of you want to buy from the UK is now more expensive because Americans buy English cars. So the entire economy of the entire country is affected because there's fiat currency. So this is what Hayek called monetary nationalism. It affects parts of the economy that it shouldn't affect. If you want an ideal distribution of resources throughout the economy, in this case, the world economy, then really a trade should just involve the two parties that the trade is between. It shouldn't involve the entire country. That now you've got artificially high prices for clothing and potatoes and everything else, which means that the distribution of resources is going to be affected by that and not ideal.
So let me just read you a quote from the Genesis book. And I think this encapsulates what you're saying. Monetary nationalism in either form disturbs spontaneous order across borders, Hayek concluded.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So this is why Hayek thought the best way of doing money is to have a global money. So have just one currency that can be used everywhere. So if Americans buy English cars, well, then the price of English cars will go up. There's more demand for English cars, but it doesn't affect the price of English potatoes or English clothing. And why would it? There's no reason that the price of clothing would be affected by car sales. Like, right, if you make a trade with each other, if you trade with each other, that it should affect the goods and service that's being traded, not every other good and service that happens to be in the same country. That's not ideal. So that's why Hayek proposed like a global currency that can be used internationally.
I think that's a perfect segue into the next part of our discussion. I'm going to read another quote. Hayek rejected stabilization policies and he rejected monetary nationalism. Instead, he advocated for a homogeneous, borderless type of money with a fixed supply, or what he called neutral money. So let's talk about neutral money.
So Hayek didn't write about this a lot, actually. He wrote about this a little bit. The concept of neutral money. So he described, so what then is neutral money? So if we're going to have an economy, we're going to have money. What is the way to organize money, to do money, that it sort of best reflects or most purely reflects the subjective preferences of everyone? How do you best do money? And his point was the best way, or the most neutral way, at least, to do money is to have, as I mentioned, a global money, something that can be used across borders, so you don't get this monetary nationalism weird side effect where different parts of the economy are affected by others, even though there's no reason for that. And he argued that it's good to have a money with a fixed supply. So a money that doesn't, change in size over time, you could say. So the analogy I made, and the analogy you could make anyways is of a ruler, right? If you have a ruler, a centimeter is always going to be a centimeter. If a ruler changes in size from one day to the next, then you can't you can measure things reliably. Yeah. Like if you're going to build a home and the ruler just changes over time, then you're going to end up with a crooked home. So the best way, the most neutral way anyways to design money is to have it as a fixed supply.
I think Hayek was largely at a loss here too, because he advocated for neutral money. He just didn't. He didn't think it was possible.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Here, so as long as there are separate sovereign states, there will always loom large among these eventualities the danger of war or the breakdown of the international monetary arrangements for some other reason. Neutral money was impossible because on a very fundamental level, nations could not trust each other. So this idea of trusted third parties or security holes kind of pops up again.
Yeah, exactly. So I mentioned Hayek wrote about this, but he didn't write about it a lot. And the reason for that is, so he described what neutral money would look like, but then he concluded that it's not possible. Yeah. So there's basically two reasons he gives for why that's impossible. The first reason, which is a valid reason, at least to an extent, is that you can't stop people from also issuing credit money or other forms of money. Like, that's still possible. But the other big one is indeed that for any money, including a neutral money, he thought anyways, you need some institution to actually manage that. So there needs to be an institution that's in charge of the money, that manages it, that regulates it. But countries cannot trust each other with such an institution. If that country exists within a country you're going to be at war with, well, they're probably going to abuse that power. So there's no way to actually realistically design it. So Hayek described neutral money. He described it as, a form of money that would best reflect the best allocate resources throughout the economy, basically best facilitate that in a neutral way. But he said it's not possible. So he wrote about it a little bit, not a lot, because he just thought it was sort of a pipe dream in a way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What were his thoughts on gold? It seemed like before this, gold was almost the best neutral money that sort of existed in nature.
Yeah,
so societies and civilizations.
Hayek went through different stages in his career, right? So early on, when around the time that he described neutral money, he didn't love gold, but he did kind of figure it's probably the best way we can do it. It probably comes closest, but it's still not ideal. You can still create more gold. It's not fixed, right? You can, if there's more demand for gold, more of it can be created, and that would still be a non-ideal or non-perfect form of money in that sense. And later on, he also he kind of criticized gold for he didn't really see the point of it. He did believe that you could create money that's better than gold. Like it should be possible for humans to create a better form of money. So he was not really a gold bug, but early in his career, he did sort of accept it as probably the best option for now, sort of.
This idea of, and again, one of the reasons you'd want a neutral money would be to prevent things like a currency war per se, or devaluing of exports. What are your thoughts on the game theory? I mean, I think looking at what Keynes missed when he said the rules of the game, right? It was like when you and I read that, it was like I chuckled to myself, like he really actually believed this, like that that there wouldn't be currency wars, and the game theory behind that, it's almost like a prisoner's dilemma in a way, where if one person does it, then you better do it, or else you're going to get screwed. But if nobody does it, obviously everybody wins. But
the problem there is that it benefits your export, so it benefits your economy if you devalue your currency as a country. If you devalue your currency, then your products and services become cheaper for everyone else, every other country. So it provides an export boost. It's good for your economy. But that at the same time, like, it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So if your exports increase because of that, then your neighbor country, their exports are gonna decrease. Like you're kind of stealing their exports in a way. You're taking it from them. So then the only option they have is to also devalue their currency. To sort of start to be able to compete again. So that's how you get in sort of this downward spiral where everyone's devaluing their currency to boost their exports, and everyone else has to follow suit. So that is what happened in the 30s. So that's considered a currency war. So the game theory is kind of perverse there. So the rules of the game sound nice, but the game theory just doesn't match that, and that's why it fell apart quite quickly.
1913 was the first separation from the classical gold standard. And just 17 to 18 years later, we've got the coverage ratio of gold, and then Executive Order 6102, which was done by FDR during the Great Depression.
So the point was, until then, there was a gold coverage ratio. So the central bank could manipulate interest rates, but they were limited in how much they could actually do. So they were limited in how much money they could lend to the government and how much money the government could spend, essentially. So to take that limit away, the gold coverage ratio was not removed entirely, of course, but it was under FDR, they banned gold. So individual Americans could no longer hold gold.
Yeah. Which was obviously blatantly unconstitutional. I'm not sure how they got away with it.
Yeah, they were forced to, exchange their gold for fiat currency, $4 in the bank. And then a couple of months later, the peg was changed. Do you have the numbers in front of you?
So I think it was around $20.67, and then a few months later,
35.
It was 35 per troy. Yeah.
So because of that, all of a sudden they had plenty of gold again to increase their room for maneuver when it came to printing money and currency manipulation. But it's a pretty interesting point in American history. It's kind of interesting that it was even accepted by the people back then, right? Like nowadays, I don't see that happening. Nowadays, can you imagine the government just telling people you can't own gold. You're forced to exchange it, and people going along with that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm very confused by what happened during that time and how that was even allowed. I mean, it's obviously blatantly unconstitutional. And if you go back in our nation's founding in history, I think early on it was actually, a lot of the counterfeiting and the money stuff was at the founding fathers, I believe, spoke about this at length. I don't know how deep your research is on this, but initially, the counterfeiting of money, these types of things were punishable by death, I believe, early on in the United States early history. Are you familiar with that at all, or have you heard that before?
I don't think I've heard that specifically.
Yeah,
no.
I do believe that the founding fathers were very aware of this, and they spoke on this, and it was in their writings and conversations, and it was a crime to do what FDR did essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting precedent, and it's something that's it's worth being aware of that actually happens. At some point.
I mean, he's glorified in educational textbooks growing up. I mean, everything I ever read about him was like he's this giant hero, for stealing everybody's savings and doing this. Again, it's hard to argue that maybe his heart wasn't in the right place when he thought it was best, or it's like we talked about before. Why do we always feel like something has to always be done when we get in these situations? And I think the failure of gold as money is largely due to some of its inherent fundamental characteristics, which allowed this centralization to the point where this was even possible to begin with, right? Because when you have a money that's centralized and notes are issued off of it, it's like the slow boiling of a frog. Yeah. Eventually, humans are going to abuse that ability.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point you bring up. Actually, yeah. I doubt. I'm not sure if it would have been possible if more people actually held their own gold. Like, because everyone was holding their gold in banks anyways.
Yeah.
Like, because all the gold was centralized, it was way easier to actually get this through.
Oh, well, indeed, this was, a slow boiling frog over time of, first in private banks, then the private banks abused, and then the regulators came in and said, hey, we need to monitor this. And then there's this slow nationalization of this whole apparatus. And then the ability, over time, we see with the initial breaking of the gold exchange window in 1913 to fund World War I because it was right or just or whatever. And then, the Fed creeping in, having more authority, and then FDR basically banning gold for the population, and then the slow, Bretton Woods in its first iteration where, hey, everyone else, the US dollar will be backed by gold and everyone else will just trade off the US dollar. And then, Nixon in 1971, eventually, basically, all these countries were sending boats to collect the gold and get their gold back because they knew that the U.S. was up to some funny business. And like you said, lending out more than they should and, or issuing more notes off of a fixed amount supply of gold than could be claimed. They were getting called on this. They were getting called on their bluff, essentially. And then Nixon essentially just took everything off the gold standard in 1971. And thus begins the great fiat experiment.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Basically, every time, like it's happened several times, even in the span of the last, a little over 100 years, gold is essentially become centralized. That's the way that's practically useful, and time again, that's abused, and eventually the gold backing just sort of is abandoned or disappears. And if you think you have a claim to gold and you don't, and it's because it's centralized.
All right, let's end this episode here. And then in our next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about the denationalization of money and go maybe a little bit further and discuss some other topics around this.
Yeah, sounds good.